First Chronicles chapter 10 is where we're at. I don't know if you've ever made a mistake and then you learned from that mistake. Sometimes we don't, right? I mean, sometimes we make mistakes and we don't learn from them, and that can be painful. I think, I just remember when I first started driving, I don't know what it is about a teenage mind, but I honestly believe if kids are anything like I was when I was young, 16 or whatever, they should never give a license to a kid who is that age. Because I would just get in behind the wheel of my car and I would drive faster than I ever should drive for no apparent reason. But I just remember driving down a frontage road. I was going 70 miles an hour. The freeway was right there, and the speed limit there was 65, but I was too scared to drive on the freeway because I'd only been driving for a week, and so I thought it was less scary to drive 75 miles an hour down the frontage road. I don't know what I was thinking. Anyway, there was a special happening, like a Kmart blue light special behind me, and I ended up getting pulled over, and the police officer was like, "What are you thinking?" He looks at my license, he realized you're brand new. And I told him I was just too afraid to be on the freeway. He's like, "Come on, man. You need it. You're going to kill somebody. You need to slow it down." You think I'd learned that lesson? But then I remember driving down. Now, this is the scary thing. I remember driving down 2nd Street in Pocatello and driving so fast. This is a neighborhood. Driving so fast that when my car bottomed out on the old roads, because there was like the big dips, like my whole cab filled with dust. That's how hard it hit. I'm just like, what is wrong with me? And so I think after that I was finally like, okay, I'm not going to do this anymore. I'm going to start driving more responsibly, somewhat. But anyway, that is kind of what we're seeing here as we look at the rise of David and this whole thing. It's all written so that the children of Israel can learn from their mistakes. This whole thing, and of course, this Chronicles is written after the captivity, about 400 years before the New Testament, 400 years BC. And this is a time when they were coming out of Babylon. The temple was being rebuilt. They were coming back into the Promised Land. People were settling in, and Ezra, according to the Talmud, Ezra wrote this book. That's not 100%, but it's pretty likely that he did. If he wrote the book of Ezra as well, that he probably wrote 1st and 2nd Chronicles. But the whole thing is just to remind them, this is why we went into captivity. This is the mistakes that we made. These are the things that the Lord brought us through. And now to look at this book from God's perspective, what went down, and to make better choices for ourselves moving forward. And so Chronicles starts at the end of Saul's reign and begins at the monarchy of David. And the purpose was to establish, if you will, we saw in the last 9 chapters that we did last week, we did 9 chapters in a row, we saw the bloodline from Adam all the way through to the people who were coming out of captivity. Remember at the very end in chapter 9, it was all the families of the people. And so as they're coming out of captivity, this book's being written, they can look there and they can see their own households, their own fathers, their own chiefs that are there in the land of Israel, that have come back to the land of Israel, and identify completely. I mean, what would it be like if you could look at a piece of paper and you could look at your genealogy all the way back to Adam? Wouldn't that be crazy? That's what they were looking at as they came back into the land. They could see their bloodline all the way back to Adam, but most importantly was the bloodline of David. And the reason that was the most important was because God had established his covenant, first of all, there in the Garden of Eden with Adam and Eve, moving forward to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and then finally his covenant with David, that the Messiah would come through this line, that line in the line of David. And so to establish that, and that's why it starts in chapter 10 with the end of Saul's reign rather than going through the whole thing of Saul's reign. And you can, if you're interested in reading about Saul's reign, you can go back and look at that in 1 Samuel. And it gives you the whole sordid story of Saul. And we're going to talk a little bit about that tonight, but mostly just here towards the end. So it says, 1 Chronicles chapter 10, Starting in verse 1, it says, "Now the Philistines fought against Israel, and the men of Israel fled from before the Philistines and fell slain on Mount Gilboa. And then the Philistines followed hard after Saul and his sons, and the Philistines killed Jonathan, Abinadab, and Malchishua, Saul's sons. And the battle became fierce against Saul. The archers hit him, and he was wounded by the archers. Then Saul said to his armor-bearer, 'Draw your sword and thrust me through with it, lest these uncircumcised men come and abuse me.' But his armor-bearer would not, for he was greatly afraid. Therefore Saul took a sword and fell on it. And when the armor-bearer saw that Saul was dead, he also fell on his sword and died." Now, again, Ezra didn't cover all of Saul's background in the reign of Saul, and we can see that in 1 Samuel 9 through 31. But he picks up, and this chapter here in chapter 10 is almost identical to chapter 31 of 1 Samuel. So we've covered this already in the past if you've been with us that long. But here Saul finds himself wounded, doesn't want to be taken alive by the Philistines, and if he were to be taken alive by the Philistines, of course they would abuse him. They're going to take him, they're going to torture him, and do whatever awful things they could possibly do to him, and then finally put him to death. And he sees the potential of that, realizing he's wounded, mortally wounded probably, and just realizes it's not worth living. I'm not going to make it. And so he asks his armor-bearer to take his life. And it's interesting, the armor-bearer wouldn't kill him. His loyalty is so great to him, he wouldn't do it. I'm not going to, to use a phrase that David constantly used, I'm not going to touch the Lord's anointed. I'm not going to be the one who killed the king. And of course, this was the same heart that David had. David had this same loyalty to Saul, and many times David had an opportunity to have the upper hand, and even his followers were encouraging him, take Saul's life. But this was David's heart. I'll never touch the Lord's anointed. This man was anointed by the Lord, established as king, and if God doesn't want him to be king, God's going to remove him without my help. Even though David had been anointed king, and even though he had promises from the Lord that he would be king, he would not. And so we see this guy, he's not going to betray the king, nor would he survive him. He's not going to live if the king's not going to live. I'm not going to walk out of the battle. It's kind of like the captain who says, I'm going to go down with the ship. He's not going to abandon his post. It would be shameful, in a sense, for him to go back out of battle, being the armor bearer and the protector of the king, to go out of battle without the king. And so he's faithful unto death. And it's difficult. We don't commend suicide at all. But we, as Christians, serve even a more faithful king. Now, Saul, to a degree, was kind of a scoundrel, wasn't he? I mean, he made a lot of mistakes in his life, and he did a lot of dumb things against the Lord. And yet, here's this armor-bearer servant being faithful to him even unto death. And so, too, we look at our king, who is far above Saul, Jesus, who died for our sins. And why would we do anything against him? The command isn't necessarily always to die for him. And sometimes I think it's probably harder to say, I'm going to live for him. But sometimes that does come when that opportunity, if you call it that, I guess it's not necessarily an opportunity, but a tragedy strikes. A evil ruler takes over a country. We've seen this throughout history. And it's happening now in the Sudan. It's happening now in Saudi Arabia, in Syria, in Iraq, all these places, especially where ISIS is strong, that Christians, people becoming Christians or following Jesus, are called on to give up their life. It's convert to Islam or die, or renounce Jesus and die. And so people lay down their life because what we believe isn't only worth living for, but it's also worth dying for. And Jesus, who would lay down his life for us. And so it's called on us to lay down our life for him. And I wonder about that sometimes. What would it be like if that actually were to be the case? And we feel somewhat safe here in America as Christians. And we have felt pretty safe for a long time. But if you read the history of the world, it's amazing how quickly things can change. And we've seen a lot of change, right? I mean, we've seen a lot of change just in the last 10 years. Things have changed in ways I never thought that they would change in my lifetime. Things have changed. And so we've seen a lot of change happen, and a lot of those changes that we've seen are against what the Bible would say, or against Christianity specifically. And it would shock us to learn how quickly a nation could turn from following Jesus to it being illegal to be a Christian. You know, and that's happened in the past. That happened in Nazi Germany when Hitler came to power. It happened so quickly. His people's heads were spinning. You know, and so too it could happen in our day. Hopefully, by God's mercy, it doesn't. But you just never know. You just never know. I mean, it did happen in our country for several people over the last few decades, as people were in school shootings and told to deny Jesus or die, and they laid down their life because they love Jesus. And so, you know, it could happen any time. But this guy was willing for an earthly king to lay down his life, and so too, hopefully, when that time, if that time ever comes, we would be willing to do that for Jesus as well. Verse 6, it says, so Saul and his 3 sons died, and all his house died together. Not everyone that was a descendant of Saul, because there are others that were descendants of Saul, but everyone who was part of that army, all of his sons that were fighting with him, died in that day. Verse 7, it says, and when all the men of Israel who were in the valley saw that they had fled, and that Saul and his sons were dead, they forsook their cities and fled, and the Philistines came and dwelt in them. So the enemy has taken land that didn't belong to him. Saul has died, and everybody just kind of runs away. You know, and sometimes that happens, you know, when somebody's a leader who is giving people boldness to go forward, and the leader is gone, everybody just kind of retreats. And so the enemy takes these cities. Verse 8 says, so it happened the next day when the Philistines came to strip the slain, they found Saul and his sons fallen on Mount Gilboa. And they stripped him and took his head and his armor and sent word throughout the land of the Philistines to proclaim the news in the temple of their idols and among the people. And so they send word, Saul's dead. You know, they send they send his head throughout all the land of the Philistines. You know, could you imagine if that's the way things still were? You know, hey, everybody come look, the head of the king. It's, you know, coming by. It's crazy. Some places it is that way. Praise the Lord, it's not in America. I'm glad to be an American. Proud to be an American. Oh, just kidding. Then they put his armor in the temple of their gods and fastened his head in the temple of Dagon. So the tragic death, it didn't give us these details in 1 Samuel. Didn't talk about them taking his head and parading it around and then sticking his head, I don't know, on the wall or on a post or something in the temple of Dagon. But the idea is putting a trophy in their idol's house to say Dagon is stronger than the Lord. And they should have known. They should have known that Dagon wasn't stronger than the Lord, because last time remember when they did kind of the same thing when they came against, you know, Eli was the priest, and it was, you know, kind of Samuel was out there, you know, just a young man, and in that whole wickedness that was happening within the temple, and the men of Israel decided it was a good idea to take the Ark of the Covenant and run into battle with it. And so the whole group ran forward, and they had the Ark of the Covenant, and the whole ground shook because they all cheered when they saw the Ark of the Covenant. Well, then the Philistines laid the smackdown on them, took the Ark of the Covenant, and they put it in the house of Dagon. And what was funny is they put it in all the different houses. You know, they put it in, you know, in Gath and in all the 5 cities of the Philistines. It just kind of passed it around, and everywhere they laid the ark, everyone in the town broke out in hemorrhoids and tumors, and rats started to infest them. And so they finally decided, okay, this is bad mojo. You know, this thing is, you know, killing us. And so they sent it back to the land of Israel, and they made 5 golden hemorrhoids. I don't know what that looked like. And then they made 5 rats and put it on the cart and sent it back to Israel. And after it was gone, they were, you know, relieved. quite literally. Here's the thing. Why would they think that after that episode that Dagon is still stronger than the Lord? And so that's kind of what they're trying to do, is boast. And of course God is going to get vengeance for that. But it says, verse 11, and when Jabesh-Gilead heard all that the Philistines had done to Saul, all the valiant men arose and took the body of Saul and the bodies of his sons, and they brought them to Jabesh and buried their bones under the tamarisk tree in Jabesh and fasted 7 days. Now, if you remember, if you're familiar with the book of 1 Samuel, you remember that Saul he'd been anointed king. He hadn't quite risen to the power of king. I mean, in other words, the people in the land had not quite accepted him as king. And he got word that the men of Jabesh-Gilead were being harassed by an Ammonite by the name of Nahash. And Nahash had brought his army up against Jabesh-Gilead. They camped all around. And the men of Jabesh-Gilead, they realized that they were outnumbered, outpowered, and so they sent word, what terms of peace will you give us? And Nahash said, I'll give you these terms. Every single one of you has to poke out his right eye and come out of the city. And then there'll be peace. Basically, I want to shame you. I want to blind you in half your eye. You'll basically be, disgraced. And so they said, give us some time to think about it. And they sent people out in all directions to try to find somebody to deliver them. And the word came to Saul. He heard that they were being attacked. And so he gathered all Israel together. He marched in and took out Nahash. And the men of Jabesh-Gilead were spared by Saul. And of course it says that the Lord delivered them through the hand of Saul. So the Lord was with him. And the Lord gave a great victory in Jabesh-Gilead. And so these people were very loyal to Saul. They had been delivered by him. And that there is that. I think that's true. When somebody has been a mentor to you, has been kind to you, even if they go off the rails, you always have a heart of compassion for them, don't you? Just because they make a mistake in their life, because they had helped you in the past. I have several people like that in my life that I've seen kind of go off the rails or go the wrong direction, and yet I know that the Lord used them in my life, and so I pray for them, and I would do their funeral if I had to, or I'd help them out or help their family, because of the way that they'd helped me. And that's kind of how these guys felt about Saul. But the next verse is kind of chilling. It says there in verse 13, so Saul died for his unfaithfulness, which he had committed against the Lord, because he did not keep the word of the Lord, and also because he consulted a medium for guidance. So two things are listed here. In 1 Samuel chapter 13, when Saul was there waiting for Samuel, the people were starting to get restless. The appointed time for Samuel to come to do the offering before the people and to inquire of the Lord and allow the people to see that the Lord was on their side had passed, and Saul became impatient, seeing that the people were becoming impatient, and so he said, bring the sacrifice. And he is the king, which was forbidden for him to do, sacrifice before a burnt offering before the Lord. It was not okay. And Samuel finally got there, and he said, "Hey, this is forbidden for you to do." And the Lord, he's told him at that time, the Lord is going to give your kingdom to someone who is better than you. And so that was kind of the beginning of the end for Saul. Well, then you march a few chapters forward to chapter 15, and you remember that he was supposed to wipe out the Amalekites, this horrible race of people that were just super wicked in all that they did. And this is how wicked they were. He says, don't even keep the animals alive, because the animals had been defiled by the men, if you can even imagine. And you read the records of these Canaanite peoples and some of the things that they did, throwing their babies into the fire as a sacrifice, just really sick and sad things, and nobody was safe. And so he says, go in and just wipe the entire group out. But Saul, having a wicked heart, he kept the animals alive, and he brought, instead of killing everyone like he was instructed to, he brought Agag, the king, with him. And Samuel gets there and he hears the bleating of the sheep. He sees Agag the king. He's like, what in the world is going on? And he says, I've done everything that the Lord's commanded me to do. And he says, why do I hear the bleating of the sheep? And who's this guy? And he says, well, this is the king. I took him captive, which he wasn't supposed to do. And he said, and that's the sheep. I brought them to sacrifice before the Lord. And Samuel said something very chilling, and I think it's a word for us. He says, to obey is better than sacrifice, and to hearken unto God's voice than the fat of rams. Don't think that you can get by saying, oh, I'm not going to obey the Lord, but I'm going to sacrifice to the Lord, and it's going to be okay. He says, no, it's not okay. And so, again, just one more thing, and then finally, and so he in a sense betrayed the Lord, but then he consulted a medium. And God takes this very seriously. What was ironic about Saul is he banned all the witches from the land, and all the soothsayers, and all the stargazers, and all the people who were into that type of necromancy. He banned them from the land, but then he disguises himself, and he goes into this witch, this medium, and he asks her to call up the dead. Can you call somebody up from the dead? She's like, I can't call anybody up from the dead because, it's Saul, the king. He would put anybody to death. And he's like, you just do it anyway. You'll be safe, whatever. And so she does it. And you can tell that, maybe she's a fraud or something like that. But Samuel actually comes up. And she freaks out. And she's like, you. And she knew at that point. She knew it was Saul. She's like, you are Saul, And Samuel comes up and he's like, why have you woken me up from my slumber? And, and basically he says, hey, you're going to be with me pretty soon. It was a pretty bad deal. But God forbids that. And it's such an interesting thing, because on one side here's Saul, who's condemning, those who would read palms and those who would read leaves or whatever they did in those days. All this necromancy, or worshiping the creation rather than the Creator. And he would basically say, this is evil, do not do it. Anybody who does it's going to be put to death. But then he would go and do it himself. Why? Notice this verse 14. It says, but he did not inquire of the Lord, therefore God killed him, and turned the kingdom over to David, the son of Jesse. Wait, I thought the Philistines killed him. Well, what that means is that God removed his protection from Saul, and he died. Now, here's the interesting thing. And this is what I want you to kind of to mull over. Samuel said, pretty soon you're going to be with me. Was Saul saved? That's a big question, isn't it? And you look at throughout the Bible, and there's a lot of people that die, they're disobedient to the Lord, they made huge mistakes. You think of Ananias and Sapphira, you think of Saul, you think of Nadab and Abihu, who brought strange fire before the Lord and they were killed. You think of Adam and Eve, who sinned in the Garden of Eden. Were they saved or not saved? Well, really, it's not for us to judge that. But just because God wiped them out doesn't mean they weren't saved. I think that that's an interesting concept to think about, because I think we just like to think black and white. Like, okay, good person saved, bad person not saved, right? They made a mistake. But if we were judged by the same measure that Ananias and Sapphira were judged when they were dishonest before the Lord, how many of us would make it? I mean, it would be scary to go to church every Sunday, You write out your check for the offering, poof, you're gone. You fall down dead. That's kind of a scary thought. I think God uses, and it was kind of instrumental as you look at Nadab and Abihu. God was opening up his temple. He's saying, hey, I'm serious about this. 2 guys were killed. And then fast forward to the New Testament, the church is early, young, and people were giving offerings to the Lord, and then Ananias and Sapphira wanted to look good. And so they said, oh, we gave the whole amount, when they held back some for themselves. Now it was all theirs to keep if they wanted to. But God killed them. They just fell down dead. Why? As an example, because I think that we as the church have to look at those examples. Just like the reason they wrote this book, we have to look at those examples and say, God's serious. And I don't want my life to be a waste. Right? Because, I think that if we kind of go off the rails and ruin our witness for the Lord, God could set us on the shelf, or maybe God would just take us out so that we don't do any more damage to anybody. It doesn't necessarily mean I'm not saved, or the person who died wasn't saved. Maybe they were, maybe they weren't. That's not for us to judge. I think we should take it as a huge warning. But it's so that we can learn these lessons. And so he says very clearly that it was because he did all these things that God took him out. He allowed him to be killed. And notice, because he didn't inquire of the Lord. And so God turned the kingdom over to David. Now, one thing that's different about David was he always consulted the Lord. You see that about David all the time. David inquired of the Lord. David inquired of the Lord. It's obvious that we should do this. And yet, God, what did David do? He still inquired of the Lord. Even though it seemed like a no-brainer. No, nothing's a no-brainer in the kingdom of God, is it? And we should always inquire of the Lord. We should always seek the Lord, whatever decision we're making as Christians. Don't we say that in Proverbs 3, 5, and 6? Trust in the Lord with all your heart, lean not to your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge Him, and He will direct your paths. And if you don't acknowledge Him, what happens? We fall down, we make mistakes, we blunder. And yet if we do acknowledge Him, we do seek the Lord, then He's going to direct us. And we can hold on to that by faith. It's just like James says in James 5:1, if any man lacks wisdom, let him ask God, who gives to all men liberally and without reproach. And so trusting the Lord and asking Him the wisdom that we need to move on, because if we're not inquiring of the Lord, then we're walking according to our own ideas. How many times have you thought that something was a really good idea and you moved forward in it and you didn't pray about it because it just was so obvious this is a good deal, it's a good proposition, it's a good way to go. And just moving forward, you find yourself in a big mess. It happens more than we want to admit. And so Saul didn't inquire of the Lord, he inquired of a medium. But David always inquired of the Lord, except for a few times. And how'd that go for David? It was pretty bad when he didn't. Whenever he didn't inquire of the Lord, it was 2 or 3 times. It wasn't very much. But you think of course, Bathsheba was an obvious one. But it's not a good thing when we don't inquire of the Lord. And so verse 1, chapter 11, says, Then all Israel came together to David at Hebron, saying, Indeed, we are your bone and your flesh. Also in past time, even when Saul was king, you were the one who led Israel out and brought them in. That's an interesting phrase. Just want to talk about that. It talks about David going in and out. And what does that mean? Well, it means not that he went to get burgers in California. What it means is that he would go out to battle and then he would come back home. And so whenever you see that phrase, he went out and came in, it means that he went out to battle and he came back home. Because if you went out to battle and didn't come back home, what happened to you? You died, right? And so that's what that phrase means. It's just a figure of speech that they use. He went out and in. And the Lord your God said to you, You shall shepherd my people Israel and be ruler over my people Israel. Therefore, all the elders of Israel came to the king at Hebron. In verse 3, and David made a covenant with them at Hebron before the Lord, and they anointed David king over Israel according to the word of the Lord by Samuel. Now this is interesting. God had given David the promise that he was going to be king of Israel all the way back in 1 Samuel chapter 16. It was just after Saul had sacrificed unlawfully. And remember, Samuel went up to Bethlehem. It was kind of a covert operation. And he went to the house of Jesse and he says, Hey, bring your sons out. I'm going to anoint the next king of Israel. And so Jesse brought all his sons out, 7 of them that were important. And they brought the oldest before Samuel. And he says, This isn't the guy. Then they brought the next oldest. Nope, this is not him. Nope. And God spoke. Of course, Samuel even thought, Man, surely the Lord's anointed is before me. But the Lord spoke to his heart and said, hey, Samuel, man looks at the outward appearance, but God looks at the heart. And as he goes one by one through the 7 sons of Jesse, he's like, is there another? And they're like, no. Well, except for David out watching the sheep. He says, bring him. And so they bring him in, and of course, he took the flask of oil and he broke it over David's head and poured the oil and anointed him king of Israel. Now, this was kind of a sketchy thing. Here's this young shepherd boy, just a young man at the time, probably a young teenager, preteen or something. And he's anointed as king, and it's kind of kept on the down low because if Saul found out that somebody else had been anointed king, he'd just go and kill him, right? And it wasn't long after that David would come up to that big battle where, the children of Israel on one side and the Philistines on the other side, and out in the middle of the field is the Philistine of Gath, Goliath, taunting the people of Israel. And David, this young boy, with only a sling, would defeat the giant because he trusted in the Lord. And that was kind of the beginning of the rise of David into prominence. And then being sent out as he got a little bit older, being sent out to battle and coming back in. And then the women beginning to sing as David would come in and out that Saul has slain his thousands, but David his tens of thousands. And this would be the beginning of Saul's heart turning against David and him seeing that God is giving his kingdom to this young man. And yet, this whole time as David is discovered by Saul and he runs into the wilderness and he hides out and running from Saul, and Saul's pursuing him to kill him. And all this time goes by, and yet all this time David's been anointed king. And several opportunities along the road, he's given an opportunity to kill Saul. He's in a cave. Saul's going to the bathroom. David's in there with a knife. And instead of slitting his throat, which would have been really easy to do, he just cuts off the corner of his garment. Now, it was kind of a slam, if you will. Cutting off the corner of somebody's garment was cutting off their authority. That was the trim that would say, hey, I'm the king, and so he cut that off. And when Saul was far enough away, he'd stand out on the thing, and his heart convicted him that he did it. He'd say, hey, don't you see, I could have killed you. I didn't. I'm not going to touch you. And David would prove time and time again to Saul that he wasn't going to hurt him, wouldn't take his throne, and yet he would wait all this time, always consulting the Lord, always waiting on the Lord. David never saw it as his job to make his kingdom a reality. He saw that as God's job. And I think that that's true for anything. Even if the Lord has told you, you're going to be the next president, or you're going to be whatever He's telling you. If the Lord's speaking that to your heart, let Him make it happen. Let Him bring that about. Don't try to force it. And David never tried to force it. He always allowed God to make those things come to fruition. And if it's God's will, it will come to fruition. Verse 4, and David and all Israel went to Jerusalem, which is Jebus, where the Jebusites were, the inhabitants of the land. But the inhabitants of Jebus said to David, you shall not come in here. Nevertheless, David took the stronghold of Zion, that is the city of David. So this is really interesting. You just think about this. So Jebus was Jerusalem, and when David became king, now he'd grown up in Bethlehem, just 5 miles away. Bethlehem is just 5 miles south of Jerusalem. It's not very far. And you imagine growing up in Bethlehem, and the Jebusites still have a fortress right there. I wonder if David didn't walk by that all the time and think someday God's going to drive those people out, because they were supposed to drive out all the inhabitants of the land that had squatted there and taken over. And the Jebusites still had this fortress. They were still surviving in the midst of Israel. And so that was his first thing. He's not going to just take Hebron and make it capital, or take some other place and make it capital. But David chooses the place that still is inhabited by the enemy. And he says, that's going to be the capital. Jebus, the city of the Jebusites. And this city, at the reign of David, becomes Jerusalem, which just became the capital of Israel again, right? I mean, in America's eyes anyway. It's always been the capital, but it's amazing. This city has caused more tension and more problems over the years than any city in the world. Just as it says in the prophecies that God will make Israel a cup of trembling to the entire world. And hasn't it been? It's amazing to look at the biblical prophecies concerning Jerusalem, that God would say, I will scatter the Jews over the entire world, in every tribe, tongue, and nation, every place in the world, and then God would say, I will bring them back again. And how many times has God done that? And now on May 14th, 1948, a huge fulfillment of biblical prophecy, these Jews came back and landed in the land of Israel once again. Huge fulfillment of prophecy. Man, if anybody didn't believe the Bible, all they have to do is look at the nation of Israel. And you just can't deny how faithful God is to bring his people back. But here, David now takes the city of Jebus, which becomes Jerusalem, becomes the capital of Israel, starting in David's reign, and will be the capital of the world when Jesus returns, because he'll sit on the throne of David. And so it says, David took this city, verse 6, it says, and David said, whoever attacks the Jebusites first shall be chief and captain. And Joab the son of Zeruiah went up first and became chief. Then David dwelt in the stronghold. Therefore they called it the city of David, and he built the city around it from the Milo to the surrounding area. Joab repaired the rest of the city. So David went on and became great, and the Lord of hosts was with him. So Joab, it tells us in 1 Samuel, or 2 Samuel rather, that Joab climbed the water shaft, got into the city, and opened the gate so Israel could attack the city, or David's men could attack the city. And this secured Joab as David's commander. And so he would be the head of the armies of David. And though he showed very early on that his heart was not very good, with the killing of Abner, revenging his brother's blood even after David had made peace with Abner, who was Saul's general. They'd made peace, and Joab went and killed him anyway. And then, of course, much later on, he would kill various people to keep his position, and then finally he would kill Absalom, David's son, which David never really forgave him for. And so David would sign his death warrant when Solomon became king. So it's just kind of one of those things. Verse 10, it says, now these were the heads of the mighty men who David had, who strengthened themselves with him in his kingdom, with all Israel, to make him king according to the word of the Lord concerning Israel. So a list of mighty men that followed David. And these were men who were described, interesting, in 1 Samuel chapter 2, verse 22, verse 2, it tells us that everyone who was distressed, everyone who was in debt, everyone who was discontented gathered to David. So he became captain over them, and they were about 400 men with him. And so David ran from Saul, you remember. He goes and hides in the cave of Adullam, and all these men from all over, not just Israelites, some who weren't Israelites, came and joined themselves to David. Could you imagine? You go out and you're going to start a group of guys, some raiders or whatever you're going to be, and who do you get? People who are in debt, people who are upset. It's going to be a pretty rough group of guys that David would bring to be with him. But these are the guys who become the mighty men. These men. And this is what I love about this. David maybe being a type of Jesus, and who does he draw to himself? Not the super together, not the perfect people, but the people who are in debt, the people who are distressed, the people who are, were downcast. Those are the people who come to Jesus, right? When people are just, everything's fine, life is good, I don't have a care in the world. It seems to be those who are in trouble who find life in Jesus. And so too, the same type of people were drawn to David. Verse 11, it says, "This is the number of the mighty men who David had. Jehoshabeam, the son of a Hachmonite, chief of the captains. He had lifted up his spear against 300 and killed by him at one time. After him, Eleazar, the son of Dodo," I like that name, "the Ahohite, who was one of the three mighty men. He was with David at Pasadium. Now there the Philistines were gathered for battle, and there was a piece of ground full of barley. So the people fled from the Philistines, but they stationed themselves in the middle of the field, defended it, and killed the Philistines. So the Lord brought about a great victory." Kind of amazing. So here's these two guys. One guy, we're assuming probably Philistines, came out to battle. In one battle, this guy killed 300 men of the Philistines. And then, of course, this other guy, Eleazar, stationed himself with David in the middle of this field. And the Philistines attacked. And it wasn't about trying to protect the barley. Of course, that was probably the people's food. But it was about the principle of keeping God's kingdom. And so God delivered a great victory to these guys. Now, you could think, as you read this list, and you could draw some conclusions as to why these were mighty men. Why were these mighty men of valor? Well, you could say because they were brave, or maybe because they were strong, or maybe because they killed the most men in battle and lived to tell about it. But it's more about they believed God for the victory. Just like David, when he was just a boy, would run out into the field. He didn't say, "Hey, Goliath, you wimpy turkey liver," and go after him and say, "I'm going to kill you." That's what Goliath was saying to him. "I'm going to take your head and feed it to the birds." Of course, David would go out there and he'd say, "Who are you to defy the armies of the living God?" It wasn't about David, and David didn't think of himself as able to overcome the giant of Gath. He knew God could defeat the giant of Gath. Of course, God used David in what he knew how to do, which was sling a sling, but it was more about believing God. So too, we have fights to fight in our lives, don't we? We have challenges to face, giants to face. And so we as Christians have to realize that we have the same God. The God who delivers, the God who brings victory. And if we are following God, if God is on our side, who could be against us, right? God is with us. And as we trust Him and follow Him, we realize not only does He forgive us for all of our sins, but He also strengthens us. And that happens as we walk with the Lord. And as we draw near to the Lord, He draws near to us, and we just gain such strength in that. And confidence that the Lord, in spite of our mistakes and in spite of our weaknesses, the Lord is strong. And the Lord delivers. And that's what David learned. I love to look at David's life, because if anybody in the Old Testament was in a relationship with God like we have in the New Testament, it's got to be David. He loved the Lord. He trusted the Lord. He followed the Lord. He desired the Lord, and so too should we. In verse 15 it says, "Now 3 of the 30 chief men went down to the rock to David into the cave of Adullam, and the army of the Philistines encamped in the valley of Rephaim. And David was there in the stronghold, and the garrison of the Philistines was then in Bethlehem. And David said with longing, 'Oh, that someone would give me a drink from the water of the well from Bethlehem, which is by the gate.' So 3 broke through the camp of the Philistines, drew water from the well of Bethlehem that was by the gate, and took it and brought it to David. Nevertheless, David would not drink it, but poured it out to the Lord. And he said, 'Far be it from me, O my God, that I should do this. Shall I drink the blood of these men who put their lives in jeopardy? For at the risk of their lives they brought it.' Therefore he would not drink it. these things were done by the three mighty men. So David, he's having this thirst. I don't know, you ever had a hankering for something like that? It's my wife's dad has just amazing water at his house. And whenever we go there, it's just, you want to go and just get a drink of water out of his tap, because his well, it's almost sweet, isn't it? It's just really good water. And he just has a hankering for it. And he's sitting there, probably thirsty in the cave of Adullam. He's like, man, if I could just have a drink from the well at the mouth of Bethlehem, man, that'd be so wonderful to taste that water again. It's just a little piece of home. And these guys had such loyalty and love for David, such faith in God, that they would risk their lives just to bring David a glass of water. Isn't that crazy? And then what's even crazier is that David didn't feel worthy to drink the water. I'm not going to drink these men's blood. And so he poured it out. How would you feel like you cross heaven and earth to get somebody a glass of water because they're thirsty, and they're like, oh, what? Seems crazy. Seems like they'd be upset about it, but he couldn't do it because he respected these men too much. You can't go, maybe it was one of those statements, you can't go and risk your life like that for me. I'm not going to drink it because that was foolhardy. I don't know. But anyway, David pours it out as a sacrifice before the Lord. But, honestly, the Lord blessed David for stuff like this. To give up what seemed would be precious to him as a sacrifice to the Lord. And that's just the way that David rolled. Verse 20, it says, Abishai, the brother of Joab, was chief of another three, and he lifted up his spear against 300 men, killed them, and won a name among the three. Of the three, he was more honored than the other two men. Therefore, he became their captain. However, he did not attain to the first three. So here's a second three mighty men, and Abishai, the brother of Joab. Now, interesting, Joab is not listed among David's mighty men, probably because of his, bad marks in his life. But here his brother Abishai is, and he's not as great as the first three mighty men. Didn't kill 300 men in battle, but he was pretty. Or I guess he did kill 300 men. He speared them, though. I don't know. Maybe that's the difference. Verse 22, it says, Benaiah was the son of Jehoiada, the son of a valiant man from Kabzeel, who had done many deeds. He had killed 2 lion-like heroes of Moab. He also had gone down and killed a lion in the midst of a pit on a snowy day. And he killed an Egyptian, a man of great height, 5 cubits in all. Now, 5 cubits, 18 inches per cubit, or a foot and a half per cubit. So he's a really tall guy. An Egyptian's hand there was a spear like a weaver's beam, and he went down to him with a staff, wrestled the spear out of the Egyptian's hand, and killed him with his own spear. So Benaiah was in charge of he'd be in charge of David's personal guard, and he would later replace Joab as commander over Israel. Now, one interesting thing, when we look at types sometimes, and we've looked at a few of them, David being a type of Jesus, and here we see Benaiah as kind of a type of the overcoming life. He's the son of a priest who would overcome an Egyptian, a symbol of the world, overcome men of Moab, which is a picture of the flesh, and then overcome a lion, which is a picture of the devil. Of course, the devil roars around like a roaring lion, seeking who he may devour. It says, verse 24, the things Benaiah, the son of Jehoiada, did, and won a name among the 3 mighty men. Indeed, he was more honored than the 30, but did not attain to the first 3. David appointed him over his guard. And so we have a couple guys out of each of these 3 that are mentioned here. And this is just a picture of all these mighty men, warriors. And I'm going to spare you the torture of me trying to read all of them. But I do want to highlight a few. Verse 26 through 47 lists just names. And so, but I just want to point out a couple. Verse 39, Zelek the Ammonite. So this guy isn't an Israelite, he's an Ammonite. This is part of the people of Canaan that lived there, and he had come out, maybe discontent or in debt or whatever, driven out from his people. He went and joined himself to David. And then in verse 41, Uriah the Hittite. Where do we know him from? He was the husband of Bathsheba, who David took and had Uriah killed. And yet here he's listed among David's mighty men. So he was a mighty man, and David sinned against him. But he was a Hittite, and Hittite were part of the Canaanites that lived in the land. And then down in verse 46, Ithma the Moabite. And so even a Moabite was part of David's mighty men. So you have these three interesting guys who aren't part of Israel that were there, that had defected and probably gone through circumcision and become Israelites. They could do that, convert to Judaism and be circumcised and follow the God of Israel. And so those guys were amongst David's mighty men. And the rest are all just from the families of the tribes of Israel. Chapter 12, verse 1. Are we going to be able to do this? Yeah, we're going to be able to do it. Now these were the men who came to David at Ziklag while he was still a fugitive from Saul, the son of Kish, and they were among the mighty men, helpers in war, armed with bows, using both the right hand and the left in hurling stones and shooting arrows with the bow. They were of Benjamin, Saul's brethren. The chief was Ahiezer, then Joash, the son of Shemaiah, the Gibeonite, and then it goes on and lists all these guys, so we don't have to read all of them. But these were guys who were from the tribe of Benjamin who came and joined themselves to David. And then in verse 8 it says, some Gadites joined at the stronghold of the wilderness, mighty men of valor, men trained for battle, who could handle shield and spear, whose faces were like the faces of lions, and were as swift as gazelles on the mountains. And so each group of these people, they had their own types of training. You know, these guys knew jiu-jitsu, these guys knew karate, and that's kind of what I'm saying. You notice it's interesting because it kind of tells you how they trained. These guys, they could throw stones with both hands and hit their targets. They could use a bow, right and left-handed. And so these guys were, pretty skilled that way. These guys were swift, they were strong, they were good with spears and shields. And then it goes and lists them from verse 9 all the way through verse 13. And then it says, verse 14, these were from the sons of Gad, captains of the army. The last was over 100, and the greatest was over 1,000. So there was some pretty stout guys there. These are the ones who crossed the Jordan in the first month, when it had overflowed all of its banks, and put to flight all those in the valleys, the east and to the west. Then some of the sons of Benjamin and Judah came to David at the stronghold. So these are people, when David's out running from Saul, it's kind of flashback to these guys who have come and joined themselves before David was king. And David went out to meet them and answered and said to them, if you have come peaceably to me to help me, my heart will be united with you. But if to betray me to my enemies, since there is no wrong in my hands, may God of our fathers look and bring judgment. Then the Spirit came upon Amasai, chief of the captains, and he said, we are yours, O David. We are on your side, O son of Jesse. Peace, peace to you, and peace to your helpers, for your God helps you. So David received them and made them captains of the troop. And some of the sons and some of Manasseh defected to David, and he was when he was going to the Philistines to battle against Saul, but they did not help them, for the lords of the Philistines sent him away by agreement, saying he may defect to his master Saul and endanger our heads. And if you remember that, David was kind of hanging out, hiding amongst the Philistines. They thought that David was their friend. He wasn't their friend. He was just hiding there. And so they were going to go out to battle, the battle that would kill Saul on Mount Gilboa. And David was going to go with them, and he was going to turn on the armies of the Philistines at the last minute and attack from inside. But some of them, and most of them, he had convinced that he was on their side, but some of them were like, no. And so they sent David and these other guys away. And so David didn't end up going into that battle. It says, verse 20, when he went to Ziklag, those of Manasseh who defected to him were Adnah, Jozabad, Jediel, and goes on and lists these guys. Verse 21, and they helped David against the bands of the raiders, for they were all mighty men of valor, and they were captains in the army. For at that time they came to David day by day to help him, until it was a great army, like the army of God. So these were men who aligned themselves with David before Saul's death. Again, all the men who were distressed, everyone who was in debt, and everyone who was discontent gathered to him, and he became a captain over them. So these are, just kind of a rough bunch of guys from all different tribes and different places and different nationalities. Now, this next list are those who joined David shortly after the reign of Saul's son Ishbosheth. Now, it doesn't mention Ishbosheth here. It mentions it in 1 Samuel and 2 Samuel. Ishbosheth only reigned for a short period of time over some of the tribes of Israel when David became king in Hebron. David was king in Hebron for 7 years, and then after the death of Abner, Ishbosheth kind of freaked out and everybody left him, and people killed him, and then they joined themselves to David. And so David is going to be now king over all of Israel, and he'll reign over all of Israel for 33 years. And so it lists these guys. It says verse 24 through 31, it lists those people who came from all the different tribes, and it lists them how many. It basically just tells you which tribe and how many there were. Verse 32, this is interesting. It says, the sons of Issachar, who had understood the times to know what Israel ought to do, their chiefs were 200, and all their brethren were at their command. And so you have this Issachar. Interesting, it tells us that they understood the times. And I think that's a good quality to have. You look at the world and everything that's going on in the world, and a lot of people just don't, they think, oh, things are just fine, things haven't changed, things have always been this way. And yet we live in a time that's different than any other time in the history of the world. I mean, it's amazing. You walk into a restaurant and what is everybody doing? They're all looking at their phones. Yep. They're all looking at their phones. They all have the world and all the information of the world at their fingertips. We communicate at the speed of light. We travel faster than the speed of sound. We live in an exponential times. 150 years ago, people still pretty much lived the same as they did 2,000, 4,000 years ago. Horses and buggies. And now we all drive cars. We all listen to radio in our cars. That's amazing. We all have cable. We all have internet access. It's amazing. The world we live in is phenomenal. And we live in exponential times. Things are changing so quickly. We live in a time like no other time in the history of the world. And we need to be like the sons of Issachar and understand the times that we live in. A time where nobody will be able to buy or sell without a mark in their right hand or their forehead. A time where the technology is there for that, because it's never been there for that before. That they could say, no, you can't buy because you don't have the mark, you don't have the chip, or whatever it is going to be. We live in a time where men travel to and fro across the face of the earth, just like Daniel said in the last days. Men will travel to and fro across the face of the earth, and knowledge will increase. And what do we live in? We live in a time where men travel, world travel is common, and knowledge has increased, technology has increased, and all these prophecies about the end times in the Bible that it talks about, so detailed. And we live in times where all those things are possible. A time where we could destroy, with the weapons that we have as a world, we could destroy the world something like 14 times over. Like, that's necessary. I mean, don't you think your arsenal's a little bit too big when you can destroy the entire world 14 times over? And then what's the scariest is countries like North Korea having nuclear weapons and intercontinental ballistic missiles. Think about that. It's all in the news about Rocket Man, but that's scary stuff if you really understand what that means. To think that we're in a time where these types of things could happen. When you see all these things happening, Jesus says, look up, for your redemption draws nigh, right? I mean, we need to be aware, like Issachar, understanding the times. And so then he goes through Zebulun and Naphtali and Danites and the Asherites and the Reubenites. He's just going through all the 12 tribes of Israel and how many men were in each one. Verse 38, it says, all these men of war who could keep ranks came to Hebron with a loyal heart to make David king over all Israel, and the rest of Israel were of one mind to make David king. So everybody decides David's king now. And they were there with David 3 days, eating and drinking, and their brethren had, for their brother had prepared for them. Brethren had prepared for them. Moreover, those who were near to them, from as far away as Issachar to Zebulun and Naphtali, were bringing food on donkeys and camels and on mules and oxen, provisions of flour and cakes and figs and cakes of raisins, wine and oil, sheep and oxen abundantly, for there was joy in Israel. And so David would rule, had ruled up to that time 7 years in Hebron. Now he's moved to Jerusalem, and as he's moved to Jerusalem, Ishbosheth, Saul's son, is killed, and all the people come to David and make him king. And David would rule there for 33 years and establish his reign and establish his kingdom, and everybody would celebrate. It was just a great time, the rise of King David. And that would be he'd be the greatest king to ever rule Israel. One wouldn't even come close to who David was until King Josiah would come, the grandson of Hezekiah. Hezekiah was pretty good too, but Josiah was a stud muffin. But David was the biggest stud muffin. Except for his incident with Bathsheba, the Lord would say about him that David always did what the Lord wanted him to. He always pleased the Lord, except for that one thing. And so just kind of an amazing guy. And we're going to read more about him next time. But what made David amazing? Here's the thing. David had a heart after God. He had a heart to love God, to know God, to follow God. And he never had a divided heart. In other words, he never followed after any other God. God was always his God. Even when he was with Bathsheba and making mistakes, God was always his God. And that's what God desires from us, is that he would be the Lord of our lives, that we would follow him, that we pursue him with all of our heart. And if that's the life we're going to live, we're going to live a blessed life. We're going to enjoy the abundance of the Lord in our lives. And he'll take us places we never thought we would go. He'll do things with us we never thought we would do. But also, and I think this is the most important part for us personally, is that we will have a relationship with the God of the universe, and that is what satisfies. That's what brings satisfaction in life. All the things that we do that are against the Lord, they take away from that. But as we seek the Lord with all of our heart, as we follow him, he blesses our lives. And no matter where he takes us or how crazy life gets, we have fullness of joy. Let's pray. Father in heaven, thank you so much for your word and just the way that you love us, Lord, the way that you guide us, the way that you speak to us. I pray, Jesus, that you would just help us just to keep our focus on you, Lord, as this world gets crazy and things go sideways. Lord, that we would not lose sight of who you are or what you've done or what you mean to us. Help us to be faithful to you, Lord. And that you'd be exalted, Lord, in our lives. That we would just take notice of David's life and how he loved you and how he inquired of you and how he sought after you, how he pursued you. And help us to do the same. We love you and praise you. In Jesus' name, amen.